We're here at the Ukraine Recovery Conference in Berlin with Oleksandra Matviichuk. She is a human rights campaigner from Ukraine who founded the Ukrainian Centre for Civil Liberties. This organization was one of the winners of the 2022 Nobel Peace Prize. Oleksandra Matviichuk, thank you very much for speaking to DW today. Now, you've been documenting war crimes throughout this war, even going back to before the full-scale invasion of 2022. But give us an update and tell us something about the evidence that you've been hearing from victims over the past 2 years.
When large-scale war started, we united efforts with dozens of organizations from the different regions and built national network of local documentators. Working together, only for these 2 years of large-scale war, we jointly documented more than 72,000 episodes of war crimes. And this is a huge amount, but just a tip of iceberg. Because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. Russia deliberately shelling residential buildings, schools, churches, museums and hospitals, attacking evacuation corridors, torturing people in infiltration camps, forcibly taking Ukrainian children to Russia, Russian troops abducting, robbing, raping and killing civilians in the occupied territories.
So, this is a huge catalogue, what you described there, 72,000. You, in your own personal work, you've spoken to victims, like people who have been personally the victims of these crimes. Tell us about some of the evidence that you've heard personally.
For years, I was focused on the legal practice of detention, sexual violence and torturing civilians in the occupied territories. And I personally interviewed hundreds of people who survived Russian captivity. They told me how they were beaten, raped, smashed into wooden boxes, their fingers were cut, their nails were torn away, their nails were drilled, they were tortured with electricity through their genitalia, and all other horrible details. And when people ask me why Russians are doing such things, because there is no military necessity in it, I can only answer because they could.
So for you, you believe that simply the power to be able to do this is the reason why? You say there's no military necessity, or do you see any kind of systematic reason why these crimes happen?
There is systematic reason, and there is a result of long-lasting tradition of impunity. Let me start with systematic reason. Russia instrumentalized the pain. Russia used the pain as a tool how to break people resistance and occupy the country. And Russia is doing this for decades. Russia committed horrible crimes in Chechnya, in Moldova, in Georgia, in Mali, in Libya, in Syria, in other countries of the world. Russia has never been punished. That's why Russians believe they can do whatever they want.
So your organization is partly about seeking justice for that. I would like to talk about that just in a moment, about how you try to achieve that. But first of all, we're here in Berlin. We're at this big international conference called the Ukraine Recovery Conference. This is partly about the economy, but it's also about society, providing the support to help Ukraine continue through this war. Do you feel this event has been a success? Are you encouraged by what you've seen here?
We need such kind of platforms to discuss the urgent questions as recovery is, because when we speak about recovery, we have no luxury to postpone it after the war period, because we have no idea. Either we are in the end of the war, in the middle of the war, or just in the beginning of the war. Russia is preparing for long protracted actions. This means that we have to start recovery now and return Brest to local communities and to restore economic life of our country.
And in terms, let's move then to this question of seeking justice. Now, one of the most extraordinary and shocking examples of the war crimes that have been uncovered in Ukraine is one of the things you mentioned, that the children have been kidnapped and taken into Russia. The International Criminal Court has taken action on this, has taken steps. There's been an arrest warrant, an international arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. That's more than a year ago. Of course, he hasn't been arrested. So tell me about the importance of this step by the International Criminal Court. And when people hear that, arrest warrant for Putin, he's not been arrested, many people think, well, is the whole thing pointless? Explain what would be your point of view on that?
It's a very important step. First is a strong signal that justice is possible, even though delayed in time, because International Criminal Court demonstrate that we don't care that Putin is acting head of a state which has veto power in Security Council of UN, which has nuclear weapons, strong military potential, and 140 million of population. If Putin committed crimes, International Criminal Court will prosecute him. And this is a very right message, which we lack in the modern world. But also this decision will have a long-term and short-term perspectives. From the long-term perspectives, let me remind us that authoritarian regime collapsed and their leaders, who see themselves untouchable, appeared under the court. Like Milosevic. Serbia didn't want to transfer Milosevic to The Hague, but Serbia did. But it's also important from the short-term perspective, because unfortunately, even in developed democracies, there are some politicians which want to return to business as usual with Russia. And probably it's okay for countries which are not democratic to shake in Putin's hand, but it's not possible for democratic leaders in democratic countries to shake in hands with the biggest child kidnapper in the world.
So then there is both a legal reason for doing this and also a symbolic reason for doing this. There have also been attempts at prosecutions within Ukraine, like Ukraine trying to use its own legal system. Can you give us an update on that and what are the efforts being taken there?
We face with enormous amount of crimes, and that is why Office of General Prosecutor opened more than 130,000 criminal proceedings. And this is enormous amount. It's very difficult to effectively investigate in accordance of all requirements of Article 6 of European Convention of Human Rights during the war, even for the best national system in the world. Ukraine is not best national system in the world. This means that we need international assistance. But returning to Putin, Putin has immunity according to international law. And that is why it's so important to create international tribunal on aggression and hold him accountable.
And you've been discussing that this is something that would target not just war crimes, but also the crime of aggression. Could you explain this idea?
We have 4 types of international crimes. It's war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and crime of aggression. And all atrocities which we are now documenting, it's results of the leadership decision to start this war. And that is why, if we want to prevent wars in the future, we have to punish the states and their leaders who start such wars in the present. And this is a common logic. But the problem is that there is no international court which has jurisdiction to prosecute Putin and top political leadership and high military command of the Russian state for the crime of aggression. And that is why it's so important to create this special tribunal on aggression in the form of international court and hold all responsible people for the crime of aggression accountable.
Now it's clear in this case Russia is the aggressor, but you have said that your organization is also open to looking at any war crimes that may be perpetrated on the other side. Have you found any evidence of that so far of Ukrainian forces?
Sure. We are documenting human rights violations regardless of sides. And that is why, let me assure you, that the vast majority of crimes which we document in our base were committed by Russians, because it's deliberate policy of the Russian states. When something wrong was committed by Ukrainian forces and we document it, we as a human rights defenders have at least a tool how to influence the situation. We can register a criminal case, we can use international media to make pressure, we can apply to international organizations, and the case will move. But when we face with Russian atrocities, there is no tool for us how to influence to Russia.
Now, these war crimes that have taken place under a Russian invasion, partial occupation of Ukraine, it was clear at the very outset of this war that Vladimir Putin's objective, many suspect that is still his objective. Have you thought about what would happen if Vladimir Putin did take full control of Ukraine? how this culture of impunity, what would that mean for the risks to the Ukrainian people in terms of further abuses?
Russian occupation is not just changing one state flag to another. Russian occupation means enforced disappearances, torture, rape, denial of your identity, forcible adoption of your own children, filtration camps, and mass graves. But when we speak about negative impact, let me tell you what will Russia do if Russia succeeds to occupy the country. Russia will go further, because Russia is empire, and empire has a center but has no borders. People who survived from Russian captivity told us that Russians described their vision of the future like they said: first, we occupy Ukraine, and then, together with you, we'll go to conquer another countries. So, let me be clear. People in European Union are safe only because Ukrainians are still fighting.
Just before we finish, internationally, the international agenda has been very much focused on, it's kind of shifted to some extent from Ukraine to the war in Gaza since the Hamas terrorist attack of October 7th and then the Israeli action against that. And both the leadership of Hamas and also Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, have also faced legal steps from prosecutors of the International Criminal Court. This has also been extremely controversial internationally. So, to what extent is this focus on that conflict and this controversy around that, is that affecting your work? Do you feel that it is overshadowing the message that you're trying to bring to the world?
Unfortunately, this Russian war against Ukraine is not just one tragedy in the world. We can mention other countries which in current moment are suffering, like Sudan, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, Iran. You just mentioned this bloody war in the Middle East. The problem is that the international system of peace and security is not working. It can't protect people against authoritarianism and the war. And that's why it's very easy to predict that such fires, like wars, will be emerged more and more often in different parts of the globe because the international system is faulty and sparks are everywhere. So I understand that people shift their attention to different fires, but it's not appropriate for responsible politicians because the problems will not vanish. The problem will become more and more serious, and this war in Middle East one of a bright example that if we postpone to solve problems because we don't want to go from the zone of comfort today, the catastrophe will await for us tomorrow.
Oleksandra Matviichuk, thank you very much.
Thank you.